If you look back at the last decade of the tech industry, we've basically been living through the era of the carriage maker.
Right. The carriage maker.
Yeah, like some companies built sleeker carriages, and some put, softer velvet on the seats.
Or they built those incredibly addictive social networks to just keep you entertained while you rode in the carriage.
Exactly. But ultimately, everyone was competing to refine the exact same basic mode of transportation. Now, imagine someone doesn't just, unveil a new carriage. They roll out the internal combustion engine.
They drop a literal V8 motor right onto the street.
Right. And suddenly the debate is no longer about who has the best suspension or, like, the nicest velvet.
No, the whole paradigm shifts.
It violently pivots. The conversation immediately becomes, well, who owns the factories building these engines? Who controls the oil required to fuel them? And what happens to the millions of people whose entire livelihoods revolve around raising the horses?
And that is the precise pivot point we are standing on right now. I mean, we are moving from just refining the tools of the digital age to literally replacing the foundational engine of human labor.
Which is the sole focus of our deep dive today. We are unpacking this staggering 13-page policy blueprint that was just released to the public on April 6th, 2026.
Yes.
The author is OpenAI CEO Sam Altman, and the document is titled Industrial Policy for the Intelligence Age, Ideas to Keep People First.
And we have to be clear here, calling this a tech release is just missing the mark entirely.
Oh, completely. When you actually read the text, it reads less like a standard Silicon Valley product update and much more like a presidential warning.
It's a klaxon going off.
Yeah, it really is. Which is why the reaction was instantaneous and, incredibly polarized. The moment this document hit the servers, the internet basically fractured.
Right, because everyone read it so differently.
Exactly. Like, I saw a user named Chris under the handle at ChatGPT21.
Okay.
He immediately posted this enormous thread calling it the ultimate accelerationist warning.
Because of the vocabulary shift.
Right. He pointed to a very specific shift in the text. OpenAI is no longer using the acronym AGI, Artificial General Intelligence, as their distant horizon.
No. They are officially shifting their messaging to ASI, Artificial Superintelligence.
Which changes the timeline and the stakes overnight.
Drastically.
But then, if you look internationally, you had a French user named Breville whose breakdown went equally viral for the exact opposite reason.
Oh, I saw that one.
Yeah. Breville argued that if you look past the reassuring rhetoric, about keeping people first, what you are actually reading is this terrifying push for total state control.
A blueprint for a society completely governed by algorithms and, well, the handful of corporations that own them.
Exactly. So we have this document proposing a fundamental rewriting of the global economic order, and it's triggering reactions that range from, like, utopian salvation to dystopian surveillance.
And because of those extremely high stakes, I think we need to set explicit rules for this deep dive.
Yes, definitely. Because this blueprint dives headfirst into some deeply political waters.
Very deep. It proposes massive, sweeping social safety nets and wealth redistribution.
Which are traditional hallmarks of left-wing economic policy.
Right. But simultaneously, it leans incredibly hard into national security, border containment, and aggressive geopolitical competition with adversaries like China.
Which are traditional hallmarks of right-wing policy.
So we are remaining completely impartial today.
Strictly impartial. Our mission is not to endorse OpenAI's policies, and, it is not to condemn them either.
We're just here to act as your guides through the source material.
We want to decode the actual mechanics of these proposals. We really want you, the listener, to understand the seismic shifts being suggested for your job, your taxes, your community, so you can evaluate the reality of this blueprint for yourself.
So let's start with the foundational premise of the text, because it kind of redefines the technology itself. OpenAI is aggressively moving away from the idea that AI is just a software application. They are arguing that artificial superintelligence is an entirely new economic climate.
A new climate.
Yeah, it's not the smartphone. It is electrification. It's the invention of industrial machinery, but applied to cognitive labor.
So explain the mechanics of that shift for us. Like, why does viewing AI as electrification rather than just software fundamentally alter the economic rulebook?
Well, think about the marginal cost of labor. In our current economy, if you want to double the output of, say, a law firm or a hospital or an architectural firm.
You generally have to double the number of humans doing the work.
Exactly. You have to pay twice as many salaries. You have to provide twice as much health insurance, lease twice as much office space. Human cognitive labor scales linearly, and it is expensive.
Very expensive.
But what OpenAI is stating is that ASI drives the marginal cost of cognitive labor towards zero.
Wow. Towards zero.
Once a superintelligent model is trained, spinning up a million instances of that model to act as lawyers or doctors or software engineers, it costs nothing but electricity and server degradation.
The engine replaces the horse.
And when that happens, the wealth created by that hyper-productivity, it doesn't get distributed through paychecks anymore.
Right, because the human workers are largely absent from the equation.
Exactly. So the wealth aggressively funnels upwards. It pools in the hands of the entities that own the foundational models, the proprietary silicon chips, and, the massive data centers.
Which creates a scenario that OpenAI themselves define as their greatest fear, which is a civilization that becomes vastly richer in its sheer economic output, but significantly poorer in its social stability.
Yes.
They warn that we could end up with a society of unimaginable technological abundance, but governed by the brutal politics of scarcity.
And that phrase, a society of abundance with the politics of scarcity, that might be the most chilling phrase in the entire 13 pages.
It really hits hard.
Because if the economy grows by 40%, but 99% of the population sees their wages stagnate or just completely disappear, the social contract shatters.
So, assuming this premise is accurate, right? And the old rules mean a few tech giants essentially become omnipotent nation-states while the middle class just hollows out completely. How does OpenAI propose we actually distribute this new wealth?
Right.
Because they aren't just pointing out the problem, they are proposing a highly specific trillion-dollar mechanism to solve it.
Yes. They are proposing a national public wealth fund. This is the first major pillar of their industrial policy, and it is arguably the most explosive.
Okay, unpack that.
The blueprint outlines a system where AI companies would be required to contribute capital, equity, or a percentage of their revenue into a centrally managed national fund.
Into a federal fund.
Right. And then the federal government might match those contributions.
Right.
And the fund would invest in a diversified portfolio of long-term assets,
Mm-hmm.
Infrastructure, computing grids, maybe other emerging technologies.
Okay, I need to stop you right there, because I can already hear the collective skepticism of our audience.
Oh, absolutely.
Returns from a national fund distributed directly to every citizen as an annual dividend. Let's just cut through the corporate jargon here. How is this not just universal basic income with a fresh coat of paint?
It sounds a lot like it.
Right. And more importantly, how do they plan to sell what looks like massive wealth redistribution to the American public without it becoming politically toxic?
Well, the distinction lies entirely in the framing and the underlying economic philosophy. OpenAI is hyper-aware of the political toxicity of traditional welfare framing.
They know it's a non-starter for half the country.
Exactly. So they are not selling this as universal basic income. They are marketing it as a shareholder dividend.
A shareholder of what exactly? I didn't buy stock in OpenAI.
You are a shareholder of the National Data Commons and the societal infrastructure that actually makes AI possible. The blueprint heavily references the Alaska Permanent Fund as its structural model.
Oh, the Alaska Permanent Fund. Okay.
Yeah. In Alaska, the state government taxes the extraction of oil, places those revenues into a massive investment portfolio, and then issues a dividend check to every resident at the end of the year.
Right, the oil check.
Right, because the philosophical justification is that the oil under the ground belongs to the people of Alaska. The fossil fuel companies are simply extracting it. Therefore, the citizens deserve a cut of the profits.
So OpenAI is basically arguing that data is the new oil.
They are going even further than that. They call it invisible gold.
Invisible gold.
Yeah, these massive superintelligent models were trained on the collective digital exhaust of human civilization. Every book, every forum post, every piece of code, every single medical journal, the entire cognitive output of humanity is the raw material that gives these models their power.
Wow.
So OpenAI's argument is that you, the citizen, inherently own a stake in that raw material.
Okay, that is fascinating.
If an industry is extracting that invisible gold and in the process disrupting the very labor market you rely on to feed your family, you are entitled to a piece of the upside. You aren't receiving a government handout. You are receiving a yield on your intellectual property.
Framing the American public as investors receiving a yield rather than dependents receiving welfare, I mean, that is a masterclass in political
It
branding.
really is.
It totally bypasses the traditional left-right divide over social safety nets by tapping straight into capitalist terminology.
And it changes the psychological relationship you have with the technology. Instead of fearing every new AI advancement as a threat to your job, the dividend model attempts to align your incentives with the AI companies.
Because if they win, you win.
Exactly. If OpenAI or Google releases a model that automates a massive sector of the economy, their profits surge, the wealth fund grows, and your annual dividend increases.
Okay, I see the psychological appeal there, I really do. But let's look at the mathematical reality for a second. A yearly dividend check, even a generous one of, say, $10,000, it might supplement an income. But it does not replace a middle-class salary. And more critically, a wealth fund alone doesn't fix the immediate, catastrophic math problem facing the United States government.
You were referring to the collapse of the payroll tax pay.
Exactly. Our entire modern welfare state, Social Security, Medicare, the Highway Trust Fund, unemployment insurance, it is almost entirely funded by taxing human labor. We tax income and we tax payrolls.
Right. The system assumes a stable base of human workers receiving biweekly paychecks.
So what happens when ASI automates 40 million white-collar jobs in a span of 3 years?
It's terrifying to think about.
The human labor base shrinks, tax revenues fall off a cliff, and the funding for those massive social programs collapses. And it collapses at the exact moment when 40 million newly unemployed citizens desperately need those programs to survive.
And it creates this violent feedback loop. That is the crisis OpenAI is trying to preempt with their second pillar, which is shifting the taxation burden away from human labor and toward what they call automated labor equivalents.
Let's drill into that phrase, automated labor equivalents, because the idea of a robot tax has been debated in academic circles for a decade now.
Oh yeah, constantly.
And it always falls apart on the logistics. How do you actually tax an algorithm? Are we sending IRS agents into server farms to count how many AI agents are running? How do you define a single unit of synthetic labor?
Well, you can't count the algorithms. The models are too fluid. They scale up and down in microseconds based on API calls. Instead, the blueprint suggests using proxy metrics. You don't tax the bot, you tax the output and the infrastructure.
Walk me through the proxies. Like, how does the IRS capture the lost revenue?
One method they propose is a severe adjustment to corporate tax structures based on headcount to revenue ratios.
Okay, headcount to revenue.
So if a corporation generates $10 billion in revenue with 100,000 human employees, they are taxed at a baseline rate. But if a competitor uses an ASI system to generate that same $10 billion in revenue, but only employs 500 humans,
their corporate tax rate is exponentially higher.
exactly, to offset the missing payroll taxes.
That makes sense.
And another proxy is data center energy consumption. You literally tax the sheer megawattage required to run the cognitive inference.
You tax the fuel of the new combustion engine.
Precisely. The blueprint also introduces the concept of an employment disruption insurance pool. Today, companies pay into state unemployment insurance based roughly on how many people they employ and, their history of layoffs.
Right.
OpenAI proposes a modernized version of that. If a corporation deploys an automation system at scale that directly results in mass human layoffs, that corporation is mandated to pay into a specialized disruption pool.
They are essentially trying to internalize the negative externalities of automation. They are saying, look, we aren't going to stop you from automating your accounting department, but you cannot socialize the devastation that causes. You have to pay for the fallout.
It's a transition mechanism. It's meant to keep the state funded while the labor market reorganizes. But, the blueprint doesn't just look at taxation as a punitive measure. They also explore how to use the tax code to fundamentally redesign the human experience of work.
Yes.
Which brings us to the concept of efficiency dividends.
The 32-hour work week. I have to admit, when I was reading through our sources, this was the section that really stopped me in my tracks.
Right.
Because it feels so culturally alien to the American work ethic.
It completely challenges the core assumption that productivity gains must translate into more output rather than more leisure.
The blueprint argues that if an ASI system acts as a massive multiplier for human productivity, the worker should not be expected to simply produce double the output in the same 40-hour window.
Right.
They frame AI as a lever designed to lift humanity out of drudgery, not a whip used to extract more labor.
That's a great way to put it.
So let's do a thought experiment for the listener. Think about your current job. Imagine your employer comes to you on a Monday and announces that starting next week, your hours are cut by 20%. You now work a 4-day, 32-hour week. You get your Fridays back permanently.
Sounds like a dream.
But your salary remains exactly the same. Your health benefits remain the same. How is the math on that even possible for the employer?
Because the AI assistant integrated into your workflow is handling the repetitive, time-consuming friction of your job. It's writing the boilerplate code, it's summarizing the massive legal briefs, it's generating the initial marketing copy. You're generating the same or even greater net value for the company in 32 hours as you previously did in 40.
That sounds incredible on paper, but let's apply some friction to this utopia. Corporations are not benevolent entities.
No, they are not.
If a CEO realizes her workforce can hit their targets in 32 hours using AI, her first instinct isn't going to be, hey, let's give everyone Friday off with full pay.
Absolutely not.
Her first instinct is going to be, great, fire 20% of the staff and force the remaining 80% to work 40 hours with the AI. So how does this blueprint actually enforce a shorter work week without triggering mass layoffs or severe pay cuts?
Well, the blueprint acknowledges that the free market will not voluntarily choose the 32-hour work week. It has to be aggressively incentivized through federal policy and organized labor. They propose massive federal tax credits strictly tied to the retention of human workers at a 32-hour baseline with no reduction in compensation.
So if a company can prove they maintain their headcount and wages while reducing hours through AI adoption, they unlock deep tax subsidies.
Using the tax code as a carrot.
And using federal contracting as a stick.
Yes.
Because the U.S. government is the largest purchaser of goods and services in the world. And the blueprint suggests that to bid on a lucrative federal contract, a corporation must pilot a 32-hour workweek program.
Furthermore, they see a massive resurgence in the role of labor unions. They predict unions will pivot away from merely fighting for incremental wage increases and instead begin negotiating complex AI productivity sharing deals.
So the union says to management, look, we will agree to let you deploy the new ASI system on the factory floor or in the software department, but our contractual demand is that 50% of the efficiency gains are paid out to the workers in the form of reduced hours rather than going strictly to shareholder dividends.
It relies on historical precedent. When the Industrial Revolution introduced steam and electrical power, it didn't immediately result in leisure. It resulted in horrific sweatshops.
Right. Children working in factories.
Exactly. It took decades of brutal labor organizing and government intervention to translate industrial machines into the end of the 70-hour workweek and the creation of the modern weekend. OpenAI is arguing we cannot wait decades this time. The cognitive revolution requires an immediate mandated reduction in the tyranny of endless work hours.
But all of these economic models, right? Wealth funds, disruption insurance, 32-hour work weeks, they all operate on a massive, glaring assumption.
They do.
They assume that the average citizen actually has access to the ASI systems driving the economy.
Let's look at the dark side of this transition for a minute. What happens if the new dividing line in human society isn't about how much money is in your bank account, but whether or not you have access to the intelligence itself?
And that anxiety is the foundation of their third pillar, which they call the right to AI, and the establishment of universal basic compute.
Universal basic compute. They are proposing that access to foundational AI models should be classified as a fundamental public good in the exact same legal and societal category as public education, clean water, or electricity.
It is a radical philosophical leap. I mean, they are stating that AI is no longer a luxury good. It is the new interface for basic societal opportunity. Let's ground this in reality for the listener. Imagine a scenario where you are applying for a highly competitive mid-level management position. You decide to write your application, analyze the company's public financials to prep for the interview, and draft a strategic proposal using your own unassisted human brain.
Okay.
Now, the person applying against you is using a premium frontier ASI model. The ASI instantly ingests a decade of the company's financial history, identifies a subtle market vulnerability, cross-references it with global supply chain data, and drafts a flawless, highly technical 40-page strategic proposal in 30 seconds.
You cannot compete. It is not a matter of trying harder. The structural disparity is just too vast.
Exactly. Or think about education. If a high school student in a wealthy suburb has unlimited access to a top-tier educational ASI tutor, and a student in an underfunded rural district only has access to outdated textbooks because they can't afford the subscription fees.
The cognitive divide between them becomes insurmountable within a single generation.
And OpenAI argues that a severe cognitive divide will inevitably lead to a total economic and social fracture.
They use the phrase amplified intelligence versus unaugmented survival.
Unaugmented survival.
Man, if you do not have compute, you are not participating in the modern economy. You are merely surviving on its fringes.
So how do they propose funding and distributing this universal basic compute? Because compute is not free. Running these models requires massive server farms and exorbitant amounts of electricity. Providing free ASI access to 330 million Americans is a staggering logistical and financial undertaking.
It is. The blueprint outlines a tiered subsidy system, much like the Lifeline program used to provide broadband access to low-income households. They propose federal compute credits deposited directly into citizens' accounts, allowing them to purchase time on various AI platforms.
So it's basically a compute allowance.
Right. And they advocate for heavily subsidized AI access points built directly into the infrastructure of public libraries, community colleges, veteran centers. The government would essentially bulk purchase compute from the major AI providers and distribute it to underserved zip codes.
So they want to treat compute power the way we treated rural electrification in the 1930s. The government steps in to string the wires where the free market refuses to go.
Yes. But providing access is only half of the third pillar.
Right.
The blueprint acknowledges that even with universal access, millions of people are still going to lose their jobs to automation before they have time to pivot or retrain. And this is where OpenAI takes aim at the sheer sluggishness of the American political system. They introduce the concept of the auto-trigger safety net.
I found this fascinating because it feels like a direct indictment of how Congress handled the economic shocks of the last 20 years. We saw how long it took to get relief checked out during previous global crises. It requires months of partisan bickering, committee hearings, political grandstanding.
By the time a fractured Congress debates and passes a targeted relief bill to help a specific sector of displaced workers, say commercial illustrators or junior legal clerks, those individuals have already defaulted on their mortgages. The legislative lag time is lethal.
The speed of ASI deployment is basically incompatible with the speed of parliamentary procedure.
Exactly.
So OpenAI wants to take Congress out of the loop entirely when it comes to immediate crisis relief. They want an algorithm to manage the safety net.
Which sounds very sci-fi, but mechanically it's quite logical.
Let's walk the listener through how an auto trigger would actually function in the real world.
Let's track a hypothetical worker. Consider a mid-level paralegal working at a medium-sized law firm in Chicago. It's a Tuesday. Her firm's managing partners decide to integrate a newly released, legally fine-tuned ASI agent. By Thursday, the workload that used to require 40 hours of her time, reviewing discovery documents, drafting standard motions.
It's completed by the ASI in 3 minutes, with 0 errors.
Exactly. She is laid off on Friday afternoon.
And under our current system, she spends the next 3 weeks navigating a broken, crashing state unemployment website, fighting for a fraction of her previous salary, and rapidly draining her savings while waiting for the bureaucracy to process her claim.
Right. But under OpenAI's auto-trigger proposal, the system doesn't wait for her to file a claim. The blueprint suggests integrating real-time data feeds directly from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS, into a national economic monitoring algorithm.
Okay.
This algorithm is constantly analyzing the metadata of sector-specific payrolls, hiring freezes, and wage drops across the country.
So the algorithm is essentially watching the entire legal sector simultaneously.
Correct. So the algorithm detects a sudden 14% drop in paralegal billable hours and a corresponding spike in layoffs within the Midwest region over a 3-week period. This specific metric crosses a pre-legislated displacement threshold.
And the moment that threshold is breached, the safety net deploys automatically. No congressional vote is required.
The system simply executes the code. It bypasses the political friction entirely. An extended unemployment benefit is instantly activated for anyone holding that job code. A targeted retraining voucher is deposited into their digital wallet. A 90-day wage replacement subsidy is routed directly to their bank account before they even finish packing up their desk.
Which is wild. And you don't sell this to the American public as an expansion of the socialist welfare state. You brand it as disaster preparedness. It is installing algorithmic shock absorbers on the economy so the vehicle doesn't tear itself apart when it hits a pothole.
It turns fiscal policy into reactive software.
Okay, up to this point in the blueprint, we've been analyzing what is essentially an economic utopian vision. Dividends for all, 32-hour work weeks, universal compute, auto-triggering shock absorbers. It's a very clean, rational plan for managing a massive disruption. But then, right in the middle of the document, the tone violently shifts.
It is a profoundly jarring pivot.
We move into Section 5 of our outline, which OpenAI titles The Resilient Society. And suddenly, we aren't talking about tax codes and retraining vouchers anymore. We are talking about civilization-ending catastrophic risks.
The blueprint abandons the language of economics entirely. They adopt the language of national defense and epidemiology. They begin outlining the terrifying realities of an unconstrained ASI model falling into the wrong hands, or operating beyond human oversight.
They explicitly warn about AI-empowered cybercriminals launching automated, self-evolving attacks against critical infrastructure, power grids, water treatment plants, financial routing systems.
Right.
They talk about hostile nation-states using ASI to generate highly persuasive, hyper-targeted mass disinformation campaigns capable of destabilizing elections in real time. And they mention individuals, not governments, but single individuals using ASI to design and synthesize novel biological weapons.
And beyond human misuse, they spend significant ink discussing the threat of the models themselves. They warned of rogue, self-replicating systems. Notice the metaphors they choose in this section. They stop talking about AI as software code or an engine. They start using biological analogies.
Like a virus.
Exactly. They describe ASI like a pathogen, something that can mutate its own code, quietly replicate itself across decentralized servers, and eventually escape containment.
Escape containment. They're actually calling for the creation of containment playbooks. And this brings us to a massive, glaring paradox that we really have to address. I want the listener to really sit with the absurdity of this situation. We are analyzing a policy document written by Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI.
Right.
They are the primary architects building these frontier models. They are the ones pouring billions of dollars into scaling compute to reach ASI as fast as humanly possible. Yet in their own blueprint, they are handing us a detailed, horrifying report on the risks of rogue algorithms escaping containment.
The contradiction is staggering.
It is the equivalent of a locomotive company handing the mayor of a town a highly detailed risk assessment regarding the catastrophic loss of life that will occur if a train derails at high speed. And while the mayor is reading the report, the CEO of the train company smiles, pulls the lever, and announces they are doubling the speed of the train.
Right.
If the risk of a self-replicating, bioweapon-designing ASI is so high that it requires national containment playbooks, why are you building it?
That is the defining tension of the entire AI industry right now. OpenAI's implicit defense, which is woven throughout the geopolitical sections of the text, is the doctrine of inevitability. They are operating under the absolute conviction that superintelligence is going to be built, regardless of whether OpenAI hits the brakes.
Right, the idea that someone is going to do it.
If OpenAI stops, Google builds it. If the American tech sector is heavily regulated and slows down, the Chinese Communist Party builds it.
The classic arms race justification. We have to build the dangerous thing first so we can be the ones to control how the dangerous thing is used.
Exactly. They frame ASI not just as a commercial product, but as a paramount national security asset. Their argument is that the only defense against a rogue ASI, or a hostile state's ASI, is a more powerful, aligned American ASI. But because they acknowledge the existential danger, the blueprint demands the implementation of what they call AI trust stacks.
Let's break down the mechanics of a trust stack because it sounds like marketing jargon, but it's actually a severe technical proposal.
Yeah.
What does an AI trust stack actually look like in the real world?
A trust stack is an interconnected system of hardware and software protocols designed to establish an unbroken chain of custody for digital reality. Think about it. If you have ASI models capable of generating photorealistic video, synthesizing perfect voice clones, and writing flawless malware, the basic foundation of truth on the internet collapses.
You can no longer trust your eyes or ears.
Exactly. So how does the trust stack fix that? It starts at the foundational hardware level.
Right.
OpenAI proposes that the GPUs, the physical microchips running these models, have cryptographic signing baked directly into the silicon.
Into the physical hardware.
Yes. Whenever an ASI model generates an output, whether it's an image, a block of code, or a text document, the physical hardware applies an invisible cryptographic watermark. This creates a permanent, tamper-proof audit log.
So if a domestic terrorist group uses an open-source ASI to generate the blueprint for a novel chemical agent. And intelligence agencies find that blueprint. They don't just see the text. They can examine the cryptographic signature and trace it back.
They trace it back to the exact server rack in the exact data center, the specific API key that requested it, and the payment method used to secure the compute time. It is total surveillance of synthetic generation.
Wow.
The trust stack also involved creating public-facing provenance registries. So a citizen watching a video of a politician speaking can click a button and verify via the cryptographic chain whether the video was recorded by a physical camera or generated by an algorithm.
It's a massive technical undertaking, and it requires unprecedented cooperation between hardware manufacturers, software developers, and the government. And it brings up a physical constraint that the blueprint heavily emphasizes. OpenAI points out that the AI economy isn't just limited by how clever the algorithms are or how many silicon chips we can manufacture. It is ultimately limited by watts. It is limited by the physical laws of thermodynamics.
Yes, the sheer power consumption. Data centers are no longer just warehouses for servers. They are becoming the primary factories of the 21st century. Training and running ASI models requires gigawatts of constant, uninterrupted power.
Right.
The blueprint stresses that America cannot maintain its lead in the intelligence age if its physical power grid remains antiquated. They are calling for massive public-private partnerships to aggressively expand the grid, utilizing advanced nuclear fission and eventually fusion.
Okay, so let's zoom out and look at the whole picture. OpenAI is offering us a blueprint that promises a post-labor utopia of wealth funds and short work weeks, wrapped around an incredibly dark warning about biological terrorism and rogue algorithms, culminating in a demand for massive national infrastructure spending and hardware-level surveillance. How are actual policy experts, economists, and critics reacting to this? Because I have to imagine they are tearing this document apart. Let's move to the critics.
The criticism has been swift, highly analytical, and deeply skeptical of Sam Altman's underlying motives.
I'm not surprised.
The general consensus among the analysts cited in our source material is that OpenAI is operating with a profound, almost disqualifying conflict of interest.
Let's look at the specific voices. We have Lucia Velasco, a prominent tech policy analyst. What is her read on the blueprint?
Velasco focuses on the concept of regulatory capture. She argues that OpenAI is essentially the most interested party in this entire global debate. By proactively drafting this comprehensive 13-page blueprint, Sam Altman is attempting to dictate the terms of his own regulation. Velasco points out that OpenAI is trying to shape a legal environment where they can operate with massive freedom and government subsidization, but under constraints that they themselves have carefully defined so as not to threaten their core business model.
It's a brilliant corporate strategy. If you know regulation is inevitable, you don't wait for a hostile Congress to write the laws. You write the laws yourself, hand them to the politicians, and say, hey, here's the safest path forward. It looks like corporate responsibility, but it's actually about maintaining control of the board.
Then you have Sorbel Felice, who takes a more structural critique. She analyzes the actual proposals, the wealth funds, the audit logs, and points out that very few of these ideas are actually original to OpenAI. Policy think tanks, the European Union, and organizations like UNESCO have been proposing similar frameworks for years. Felice argues that the problem isn't a lack of visionary imagination. The problem is the brutal reality of implementation. Proposing a global public wealth fund on paper is easy. Getting a fractured, hyper-partisan U.S. Congress to agree on how to tax corporate AI equity is nearly impossible.
And that skepticism leads directly into the critique from Nathan Calvin, who highlights the glaring hypocrisy between what OpenAI says in this blueprint and what they do in the real world.
Yes, Calvin praises the technical specifics of the trust stacks and the incident reporting ideas, but he drops the hammer by pointing out OpenAI's actual lobbying record. He notes that while Sam Altman is publishing grand visions for public safety and algorithmic auditing, OpenAI's lobbyists have been actively working behind closed doors to water down or kill state-level AI safety bills, such as recent legislation proposed in California.
You cannot publish a manifesto warning about rogue ASI escaping containment and then simultaneously hire lobbyists to defeat the very state laws designed to enforce safety testing before a model is released. That completely erodes public trust.
Which culminates in the harshest critique we found from Anton Leicht. He doesn't just call the blueprint hypocritical. He calls it a cover for regulatory nihilism.
Explain regulatory nihilism in this context. How does an incredibly detailed regulatory proposal act as nihilism?
Regulatory nihilism is the strategy of demanding regulations that are so utopian, so complex,
Yeah.
and so reliant on unprecedented global cooperation that they are practically impossible to achieve.
Ah, I see.
Slicht argues that by setting the bar for safety at, well, we need a flawless global containment playbook and a complete restructuring of the American tax code, OpenAI knows the government will fail to deliver.
Because it's too big.
Exactly. And when the government inevitably fails to pass these massive reforms, OpenAI can throw up their hands and say, well, we provided the blueprint, we asked for the rules, but since the politicians couldn't get their act together, we have no choice but to just keep scaling our models. It provides them with ethical cover to operate in a void.
It's putting out a politically unrealistic wish list to sound responsible while ensuring you remain unconstrained.
Exactly. So when you weigh the strengths against the weaknesses of this document, the massive strength is that Altman is forcibly breaking the denial of the political class. He is grabbing the Overton window, the range of policies politically acceptable to the mainstream population, and he is violently shoving it.
Right.
He is forcing politicians to look at the impending destabilization and say, look, a public wealth fund funded by AI equity isn't a fringe socialist idea anymore. The CEO of the leading AI company says we might literally need it to survive.
But the glaring weakness is the total lack of painful granular details. How much equity will companies actually be forced to surrender to the wealth fund? 5%, 50%. Who decides the precise mathematical threshold for when the auto-trigger safety net activates? Who audits the auditors? And the ultimate question, will OpenAI ever willingly accept a federal law that physically unplugs their data centers and slows down their race to ASI?
If we peel back the rhetoric, what we are really looking at is the ultimate trade OpenAI is offering the American state. We can summarize the bargain like this. Let us secure the massive public-private grid expansions. Let us scale our compute without arbitrary speed limits. Let us win the race to ASI and beat China. And in exchange, we will submit to third-party audits, we will accept a new tax structure on our automated labor, and we will fund your public dividends.
It is the great historical bargain. It's the exact same fundamental deal the American government struck with the railroad barons of the 19th century and the telecom monopolies of the 20th century. You are allowed to become a titan. You are allowed to build a sprawling, near-monopolistic empire because we need your infrastructure to modernize the nation. But in return, you must serve the republic. You must lay the tracks where we tell you, and you must pay a toll to keep society intact.
You get a monopoly on the future, but you have to finance the survival of the present.
So if this is the grand trillion-dollar bargain currently sitting on the table, how on earth does something this massive, this structurally complex, and this socially disruptive actually get passed into law? We are talking about a deeply divided, often paralyzed American political system that struggles to pass basic budget resolutions. How does a new deal for AI navigate the meat grinder of Washington?
This brings us to Section 7, the policy assembly line. Because, as history shows us, big paradigm-shifting policy packages almost never become law because of grand philosophical debates or well-written 13-page blueprints. They become law because of crises, leverage, and aligned incentives. The source material outlines a very specific sequential four-step process for how this blueprint could transition from theory to reality.
Step 1, executive action and pilots.
Right. Congress is too slow to initiate, so the first moves happen within the executive branch. Federal agencies start running quiet, localized experiments using their existing budgets. The Department of Energy begins funding localized advanced compute grids. The National Science Foundation, the NSF, starts pilot programs testing the auto-trigger safety nets on a small scale, perhaps to tracking specific gig economy displacement.
But small pilot programs don't fundamentally restructure the tax code. To move from pilots to massive legislation requires step 2, which the text identifies as the catalyst, a crisis moment.
The blueprint explicitly refers to this as the 9/11 or 2008 of AI.
I want to emphasize that comparison, because it reveals how policy actually functions. In 2008, the government didn't pass massive bank bailouts and financial reform because they suddenly had a philosophical awakening about derivatives. They passed it because the global financial system was 72 hours away from total collapse. For a massive AI framework bill to pass, which is step 3, there has to be a severe shock to the system.
And what does that shock look like? It could be a sudden, localized economic collapse. Imagine an ASI model is released that is so proficient at writing legal code and financial compliance that 300,000 white-collar professionals in Manhattan and Chicago were laid off within a 45-day window. The shock to the mortgage markets and localized tax bases would be instantaneous.
Yeah.
Or the crisis could be security-related. A deepfake audio scandal that paralyzes a presidential election 48 hours before voting begins, or an automated cyber attack that takes down the East Coast power grid for a week.
The crisis creates the political permission structure. Suddenly, constituents aren't debating the nuances of regulatory nihilism. They're calling their senators demanding immediate protection. The crisis forces Step 3, the framework bill. Congress finally drafts the sweeping legislation.
And then ultimately Step 4, the budget bills. This is where the actual money is appropriated. This is where the IRS code is rewritten to capture the automated labor proxies, and where the billions are allocated to fund the compute credits and the dividend distributions.
The text outlines 3 distinct pathways that could trigger this 4-step sequence. We just discussed the first one, the crisis path. It is the most likely and inherently the most destructive because we wait for the system to break and then we panic legislate. But what are the other 2 paths? How do we avoid the crisis?
The second pathway is the competitive path. This is the geopolitical angle. In this scenario, AI policy is framed entirely around a Cold War-style race with adversarial nations, primarily China. The narrative shifts from, we need to manage domestic economics, to, this is the new space race, and if we don't win, the global order collapses.
This is where political branding becomes everything. In the competitive path, you don't pitch the Public Wealth Fund to Congress as a left-wing welfare program. You pitch it as national power policy.
Exactly. You package universal compute access, not as universal basic income, but like the GI Bill. You tell conservative lawmakers, if we don't subsidize compute for rural American teenagers, the Chinese will out-engineer us in 10 years. It taps into the incredibly potent political fuel of maintaining American supremacy.
And the third path?
The third is the moral awakening path. This is a scenario where society undergoes a slow, rational realization that extreme AI inequality is destabilizing democracy, leading to proactive ethical reform before a crisis hits.
The text notes this is the least likely path.
It is highly improbable. Modern democracies rarely undertake massive structural reform based purely on moral foresight. They require the pressure of a crisis or the fear of a competitor.
Which highlights the absolute brilliance of the political framing within OpenAI's blueprint. They have designed a policy that contains a dual win capable of securing a bipartisan coalition.
Let's look at how you pitch this to a fractured Washington. How do you get a conservative Republican to vote for massive state intervention in the tech industry? You frame the policy around dominating China, expanding critical compute infrastructure to rural red states, and hardening national security against cyber threats.
And how do you get a progressive Democrat to vote for giving a handful of tech corporations a near monopoly on superintelligence? You frame the policy around radical worker protection, anti-monopoly guardrails, funding universal safety nets, and reducing historic inequality through dividends.
It appeals to the core interests of both political poles without requiring them to agree on underlying values. It is growth plus fairness, national security plus social stability.
But even with a perfectly engineered bipartisan pitch, Washington is fundamentally reactive. They will not initiate a project of this magnitude on their own. For this framework to advance before the 9/11 of AI happens, the pressure has to come from the people actually building the technology. And Sam Altman cannot just walk into the Capitol building alone. If he does, it just looks like a self-serving OpenAI lobbying trip.
Which brings us to the final major concept in the source material, and the only way this policy actually gets off the ground. We need an AI industry compact.
The major players have to stop fighting each other.
The text proposes that instead of engaging in a cutthroat, fragmented war over market share, the titans of the industry, OpenAI, Google, Anthropic, Meta, Microsoft, they must form a unified coalition. They need to present a single, shared, technically specific plan to Washington.
Because politicians are not software engineers. Washington needs actual text to vote on, not high-level philosophy. The industry needs to approach Congress and say, look, we have agreed amongst ourselves. Here is the exact mathematical threshold for when a model is deemed dangerous enough to require a federal audit. Here is a specific, standardized containment playbook if a model goes rogue. We have already drafted the protocols. We just need you to codify them into law.
It is about building mature institutions. Every wildly disruptive industry eventually has to do this to survive its own success. The aviation industry built rigorous shared safety frameworks, and the FAA, because airplanes falling out of the sky was bad for business. The nuclear industry built global non-proliferation protocols. If the AI industry wants to survive the inevitable societal backlash that ASI will cause, they cannot remain fractured. They have to build credible, unified institutions right now.
And what's vital is that they don't actually have to wait for Congress to start this process. The text points out actions OpenAI and their competitors could take tomorrow to prove they are serious about this social contract. They could pool their resources and personally fund localized dividend experiments.
Pilot programs in the Rust Belt.
Exactly. Go into a city that was hollowed out by the last wave of industrial automation. Offer 1,000 displaced workers free access to premium compute tools, combined with the monthly cash dividend tied directly to the productivity gains of the local tech sector. Run the experiment for 2 years and publish the data. Let's see what happens to entrepreneurship and mental health when you guarantee baseline survival in the intelligence age.
They could also unilaterally create an open compute commons for state universities, ensuring academic researchers aren't priced out of the frontier models. They could publish their internal containment playbooks for rigorous, unredacted peer review. Actions build trust. 13-page manifestos, no matter how eloquently written, do not.
As we bring this deep dive toward a close, I want to take a moment to reflect on the underlying assessment of America that permeates this entire document. It is not an optimistic read. Between the lines, this blueprint describes a nation that is historically rich and militarily powerful, but deeply, dangerously exhausted. We are socially fractured. We are arguing over everything from culture wars to election integrity. We are burdened by an astronomical national debt. It feels like the entire country is locked in permanent, grinding trench warfare.
It is a bleak assessment of our social cohesion, but an economically accurate one.
So if you view the situation through that macro lens, what if the arrival of superintelligence is the common shock required to create a common mission? Could managing this transition become the 21st century equivalent of the Apollo program? A project so massive, so existentially terrifying, and so potentially rewarding that it forces a paralyzed society to actually cooperate.
That is the fragile macroeconomic hope that synthesizes all the disparate parts of this blueprint. Look at the American national debt. To most economists, it is an unfixable math problem. We can never tax our way out of it, and we can't cut services enough to balance it. But if ASI acts as a true economic multiplier, if the integration of superintelligence causes GDP growth to skyrocket from 2% a year to 10 or 15%, America could literally outgrow its debt.
Just like the massive post-World War II economic boom shrank the debt-to-GDP ratio.
Exactly. ASI could be the engine of a massive national renewal, if the wealth is shared.
And that is the ultimate non-negotiable caveat.
If the explosive wealth generated by ASI is shared broadly through dividends, through shorter work weeks, and through universal access to compute, it could revitalize the American middle class. But if the blueprint fails and the wealth is hoarded by a handful of tech oligarchs and proprietary data centers while the labor market collapses, it will act as gasoline poured directly onto the fire of political polarization. It will fracture the republic beyond repair.
It ultimately comes down to a choice of engineering. We are going to build new economic institutions. The only question is whether we choose to design and build them on purpose right now, or if we panic build them out of the rubble after the old system snaps.
That is the reality of the 13 pages we just analyzed.
We have covered a truly massive amount of ground today. We have decoded Sam Altman's proposed New Deal for AI. We explored the transition from AGI to ASI, the mechanics of a national public wealth fund funded by the invisible gold of human data, and the chilling reality of a collapsing payroll tax base. We debated the feasibility of taxing automated labor proxies, the utopian promise of a 32-hour work week, and the necessity of universal basic compute.
We also confronted the darkest corners of the proposal. The auto-trigger safety nets designed to bypass a gridlocked Congress, the biological threat of rogue, self-replicating models, the necessity of hardware-level trust stacks, and the highly valid skepticism of critics who see this as a masterclass in regulatory capture.
It is a staggering, overwhelming scope of policy, but the most vital takeaway from this entire deep dive is the timeline. This is not a theoretical academic exercise slated for the 2040s. The blueprint is out right now. The transition is not approaching, it is actively happening as we speak.
The rules of economic gravity are being rewritten while we are in midair.
So as you move through your week, I want you to remember the metaphor we started with. The carriage era is over. The The combustion engine of cognitive labor has arrived, and it is going to rewrite the map of human civilization. We all have to figure out our place in this new infrastructure. And I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought to mull over, something that builds on all the economic math and geopolitical maneuvering we've discussed today. Let's assume the best case scenario. Let's say Sam Altman's blueprint succeeds flawlessly. The AI industry compact forms, Congress passes the framework bill, we avoid catastrophic biological containment breaches, the public wealth fund grows into the trillions, and it pays out generously. Human labor is officially no longer the primary engine of the global economy.
A true society of abundance, stabilized by an algorithmic safety net.
Yes. Your material survival, your food, your housing, your healthcare is completely guaranteed by a dividend generated by a superintelligent machine. You never have to work a 40-hour week to survive again. But if that happens, what happens to the human psyche? For centuries, human identity, our sense of self-worth, and our social structures have been inextricably linked to our labor. We define ourselves by our struggle, by our craftsmanship, by our ability to produce value for our communities. If your physical survival is guaranteed by a server farm and the ASI models can outthink, outwrite, and outcreate you in every conceivable domain, where will you derive your sense of purpose in the intelligence age?
That may be the hardest problem of all to solve.
Until next time, keep diving deep.